Nobody aboard the USS Leviathan could have guessed that one decision by Captain Alexandra Lex Morgan would decide the fate of 180 NATO personnel trapped in Djibouti and challenge everything NATO thought it knew about submarine warfare. At 0347 hours, a secure transmission shattered the calm. A sudden military coup had blockaded NATO's naval facility. Every Allied vessel in the harbor was trapped. Coup commanders demanded inspections, their patrol boats reinforced by coastal artillery hidden among civilians. Breaking the blockade by force risked civilian casualties and an international crisis. The surface fleet's solution was predictable. Admiral Benedetti sent the Italian destroyer Andrea Doria to intimidate the blockade into submission. But the coup's tactics weren't conventional. They used fishing vessels as shields, artillery hidden near neighborhoods, and overlapping fields of fire. Within hours, helicopters were downed, a destroyer pinned in place, and NATO's 180 men and women remained prisoners of a political standoff. And in the Red Sea, dismissed as irrelevant, was Captain Lex Morgan, her submarine silent, unseen, and already calculating the one-move surface admirals refused to consider. What happened next would prove that the most powerful weapon in naval warfare isn't always firepower. It's the enemy, never knowing you're there until it's too late. The secure communication line crackled to life at 0347 hours, piercing the pre-dawn silence aboard the USS Leviathan. Captain Alexandra Lex Morgan was already awake in her quarters, reviewing Arctic navigation protocols when Commander David Lawrence knocked urgently on her door. Captain, priority message from NATO Combined Maritime Forces. Admiral Morrison wants you on the bridge immediately. Lex's emerald eyes sharpened as she pulled her auburn hair into regulation military precision. Something in Lawrence's voice told her this wasn't routine submarine patrol business. The USS Leviathan had been conducting standard reconnaissance operations in the Red Sea for 3 weeks, but the tension in her executive officer's voice suggested their mission was about to change dramatically. On the bridge, Senior Chief Petty Officer James Campbell handed her the encrypted transmission with the gravity of a man who'd served 20 years underwater. The message was brief but devastating. Military coup in Djibouti. NATO naval facility blockaded. All NATO vessels trapped in harbor by coup forces demanding weapons inspections. 180 NATO personnel unable to evacuate. But here's where everything changed. Captain, Sonar Technician First Class Lisa Harper called from her station. I'm picking up surface fleet movement. Italian destroyer Andrea Doria, bearing 285, closing fast on Djibouti harbor entrance. Admiral Marco Benedetti's voice boomed across the communication channel before Lex could respond. USS Leviathan, this is Admiral Benedetti commanding NATO relief operations. You will maintain current patrol pattern while surface fleet breaks the harbor blockade. Submarine assets are not required for this surface engagement. Lex felt the familiar sting of dismissal, the subtle undertone that suggested submarines, and perhaps female submarine commanders, had no business in complex naval confrontations. She'd heard it before, the assumption that surface warfare was where real naval battles were fought. Admiral, with respect, USS Leviathan has specialized capabilities that might prove valuable in harbor operations. Captain Morgan, Benedetti interrupted, his Italian accent thick with authority and barely concealed condescension. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this requires precision surface warfare and overwhelming firepower, not hiding underwater. This is a naval blockade situation that demands visible NATO strength. Continue your patrol. Benedetti out. The communication ended with the sharp click of dismissed authority, leaving Lex staring at the tactical display showing Djibouti's naval facility surrounded by coup vessels. Her years of Arctic submarine training had taught her to see opportunities where surface vessels saw only obstacles, but Admiral Benedetti's dismissal was absolute. Standing on the bridge of the USS Leviathan, Lex felt the familiar weight of being underestimated. It was a sensation she'd experienced throughout her naval career, the assumption that submarine warfare was somehow less decisive than surface operations, that underwater tactics were simply about stealth rather than strategic impact. But Admiral Benedetti had never operated in contested waters where invisibility was more valuable than firepower, had never used the ocean itself as both weapon and shield. His dismissal revealed not just gender bias, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern submarine capabilities could shift the balance of naval confrontations. Lex had encountered this attitude throughout her rise in submarine warfare. Traditional surface commanders often viewed submarines as specialized tools for hunting other submarines or conducting reconnaissance, valuable but limited assets in the grand scheme of naval operations. They failed to understand that a modern Virginia-class submarine was essentially an underwater weapons platform capable of projecting power in ways that surface vessels simply couldn't match. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was Admiral Benedetti, commanding one of the most sophisticated destroyers in the Italian Navy, dismissing the very submarine capabilities that had revolutionized naval warfare in the 21st century. The USS Leviathan carried more precision firepower than most small fleets, could operate undetected in hostile waters, and possessed tactical flexibility that surface vessels could only dream of achieving. What happened next shocked everyone. The next 6 hours unfolded like a masterclass in surface warfare limitations. Admiral Benedetti's plan was textbook naval engagement. The destroyer Andrea Doria would approach Djibouti's harbor, demonstrate overwhelming firepower, and force the Coup vessels to withdraw from their blockade positions. Commander Lawrence entered the bridge with updated intelligence reports. Captain, intercepted communications show the Coup forces have positioned patrol boats at the harbor entrance, backed by coastal artillery batteries. They're demanding to board and inspect all NATO vessels for weapons smuggling before allowing departure. Lex studied the tactical display, her mind automatically calculating approach vectors and defensive positions. The geography of Djibouti's harbor created natural choke points that any competent naval force would exploit. But Admiral Benedetti's confidence suggested he was relying on the psychological impact of destroyer firepower rather than tactical finesse. Through her periscope at regular intervals, Lex watched the Italian destroyer attempt to establish position for harbor approach. The Andrea Doria was a formidable vessel bristling with advanced weaponry and defensive systems, but her deep draft and surface signature made her vulnerable to the coordinated defense the Coup forces had established. The destroyer's approach was textbook naval strategy: establish fire superiority, control the operational area, project power through visible presence. But textbook strategy assumed conventional opponents and predictable tactical responses. The Coup forces in Djibouti had demonstrated neither conventional thinking nor predictable behavior. What impressed Lex was the tactical sophistication of the Coup naval commander. Instead of attempting to match NATO firepower directly, they had created a defensive network that exploited the political constraints on NATO operations. They knew that Admiral Benedetti couldn't simply blast his way through the harbor without risking civilian casualties and international condemnation. The Coup forces had positioned their patrol boats close to civilian fishing vessels and merchant ships, using human shields to limit NATO's tactical options. Their coastal artillery was emplaced near residential areas, making counter-battery fire politically impossible. It was asymmetric warfare at its most effective, using political and moral constraints to neutralize superior military technology. Lex watched through her periscope as the Andrea Doria maintained station approximately 8 kilometers from the harbor entrance, close enough to threaten the Coup vessels, but far enough to avoid the coastal artillery that backed up their naval blockade. It was a reasonable tactical position for a surface vessel, but it created a standoff that trapped 180 NATO personnel indefinitely. But you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. Captain, Petty Officer 2nd Class Ryan Walsh reported from the communication station, picking up multiple engagement reports. Andrea Doria is taking coordinated fire from coastal batteries and patrol boats. Her helicopter has been hit. Crew evacuated safely, but aircraft is destroyed. Through her periscope, Lex could see the Andrea Doria's predicament unfolding in real time. The destroyer was powerful enough to defeat the Coup patrol boats individually, but the combination of coastal artillery and mobile naval units created overlapping fields of fire that made aggressive approach impossible. Meanwhile, the NATO vessels trapped in the harbor remained hostages to the Coup forces' blockade. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly with each passing hour. Each failed attempt to break the blockade gave the Coup forces more confidence and potentially pushed them toward more extreme measures against the NATO personnel they held trapped. Intelligence reports suggested the coup leaders were growing increasingly paranoid about international intervention, making the harbor situation more volatile with each failed rescue attempt. "Captain," Commander Lawrence said quietly, studying the tactical display, "if Admiral Benedetti continues with direct surface engagement, we're going to see escalation that could endanger the trapped personnel. The coup forces are treating this as validation of their power." Lex nodded grimly. The enemy had studied NATO blockade-breaking procedures and positioned their defenses accordingly. They were forcing the Italian destroyer to operate defensively while maintaining their stranglehold on the harbor. It was tactically sophisticated and strategically devastating to conventional surface rescue operations. But what concerned Lex most was the psychological dynamic developing between Admiral Benedetti and the coup commander. Both were male military leaders operating under intense pressure, each trying to prove dominance through displays of force. It was exactly the kind of escalation spiral that could transform a political crisis into an armed conflict. The coup commander was clearly intelligent and experienced, possibly a former naval officer who understood NATO procedures and limitations. His defensive positioning demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international law and media pressure. He was forcing NATO to choose between ineffective legal responses and potentially catastrophic military escalation. Wait until you see what she discovered. "Lisa," Lex called to her sonar technician, "I need detailed bottom mapping of Djibouti harbor approaches. Look for any underwater terrain features that might provide concealed infiltration routes." Senior Chief Campbell looked up from the plotting table. "Captain, are you thinking submarine approach to the harbor?" "Just gathering tactical intelligence, Chief. Always good to understand our operational environment completely." At 13:47 hours, Admiral Benedetti's voice returned to the radio, stripped of its earlier confidence and carrying the weight of tactical failure. "USS Leviathan, this is Admiral Benedetti. We have encountered significant resistance from coup naval forces. Request your assessment of alternative approach options to Djibouti harbor." It wasn't quite an admission of failure, but Lex recognized the subtle shift in tone. The Admiral was discovering what every submarine commander knew. Sometimes the most effective approach was the one the enemy never saw coming. "Admiral, USS Leviathan requests permission to conduct underwater reconnaissance of harbor approaches. Our acoustic capabilities may identify tactical opportunities that surface vessels cannot exploit." A long pause filled the communication channel. When Benedetti's voice returned, it carried a mixture of desperation and skepticism. "Captain Morgan, explain exactly what tactical opportunities you're referring to." Lex studied the sonar displays showing Djibouti harbor's underwater topology. Her Arctic submarine training had taught her to use ocean terrain for tactical advantage, but this situation required adaptation of those techniques to warm water harbor infiltration. "Admiral, sonar analysis indicates underwater approach routes that would allow undetected positioning among the coup vessels, close enough to influence their tactical calculations through deterrent capabilities." Here's where it gets unbelievable. "Captain, you're suggesting submarine infiltration of a contested harbor during an active blockade. That's an act of war if detected, and potentially catastrophic if the coup forces panic. Admiral, that's 180 NATO personnel who have no other extraction option if surface engagement continues to fail." The communication channel fell silent except for the background static of naval operations. Through her periscope, Lex could see the Andrea Doria maintaining her distant position, unable to close with the coup vessels due to the coordinated coastal and naval defenses. The surface approach had reached tactical stalemate. Commander Lawrence moved closer to the plotting table. "Captain, the harbor configuration would allow submarine approach using thermal layers for acoustic masking. If we could position among the coup vessels without detection." Admiral Benedetti's next transmission came with the weight of military necessity overriding surface warfare doctrine. "USS Leviathan, you are authorized to conduct underwater reconnaissance of harbor approaches. But Captain Morgan, understand clearly. If this operation escalates the situation or endangers NATO personnel, the responsibility is entirely yours." It was both permission and a warning. Lex understood the political calculation. If her unconventional approach succeeded, Admiral Benedetti could claim strategic oversight. If it failed, she would bear full responsibility for the consequences. "Understood, Admiral." USS Leviathan is proceeding to reconnaissance depth for harbor approach assessment. But the real shock was still coming. As the submarine descended toward the thermocline layer, Lex felt the familiar calm that came with underwater operations. This was her domain, where the lessons learned navigating beneath Arctic ice could be adapted to the tactical challenges of harbor infiltration. "Take us down to 80 feet. Steady on course 120, she commanded. "Lisa, I need continuous sonar mapping of harbor approaches and Coup vessel positions. James, prepare all torpedo tubes for potential target acquisition, but maintain them as preparation only." The depth she'd chosen was critical, deep enough to avoid surface detection, shallow enough to maintain precise navigation in harbor waters. At 80 feet, the USS Leviathan operated in a tactical sweet spot where her advanced sonar systems could map every vessel above while remaining invisible to the Coup force's primitive detection capabilities. Senior Chief Campbell coordinated the approach with the precision of 2 decades underwater. "Diving officer, make your depth 80 feet. Helm, steady course 120. All stations report readiness for tactical reconnaissance." As they approached Djibouti harbor, Lex could feel the tension throughout the submarine. This wasn't standard reconnaissance. They were entering contested waters where political miscalculation could trigger international crisis. Every crew member understood that their actions over the next hour could determine whether 180 NATO personnel returned home safely or became casualties of escalating conflict. The underwater approach to Djibouti harbor required navigation skills that pushed submarine capabilities to their limits. Using thermal layer detection and precise ballast control, Lex guided the USS Leviathan through shallow coastal waters that no surface vessel could safely navigate. "Captain," Lisa Harper reported from sonar, "harbor entrance dead ahead. I'm counting 4 Coup patrol boats in formation blocking the channel, plus 2 larger vessels that appear to be converted merchant ships with mounted weapons." Through the harbor's outer approaches, sonar readings showed the Coup vessels maintaining their blockade formation. But their positioning revealed a critical tactical weakness. They were focused entirely on surface threats with no consideration for underwater approach. "Captain," Commander Lawrence reported, studying the tactical display, "Coup vessels are in perfect formation for a deterrent action. They're clustered close enough that torpedo solutions would be simultaneous across their entire formation." What happened next defied every naval warfare manual. As the USS Leviathan achieved optimal positioning beneath the Coup fleet, Lex implemented a psychological warfare technique that had never been attempted in harbor blockade scenarios. Using precise torpedo targeting systems, she established firing solutions on every Coup vessel simultaneously. Sonar confirmed target locks on all 6 Coup vessels. Weapons, prepare to surface for communication but maintain torpedo targeting solutions. "Captain," Senior Chief Campbell reported, "all Coup vessels locked. Torpedo solutions confirmed for simultaneous engagement if required." The submarine rose to communication depth, revealing itself deliberately to the Coup forces while maintaining underwater tactical advantage. Through the periscope, Lex could see the shock on the Coup vessels as they realized a nuclear submarine had positioned itself in their midst without detection. Lisa established communication with Coup Fleet Commander, informed them that USS Leviathan has torpedo locks on all 6 vessels and will engage in 60 seconds unless NATO vessels are immediately permitted to depart. But here's what nobody expected. The psychological impact of the submarine's sudden appearance among the Coup fleet was devastating to their tactical confidence. The Coup vessels found themselves in a position where their numerical advantage was meaningless. A single submarine could destroy their entire formation before they could react. "Captain," Petty Officer Walsh reported from communications, "Coup Fleet Commander is requesting immediate negotiation. They're asking for guarantee that NATO vessels will depart without retaliation for the blockade." Through her periscope, Lex could see the Coup patrol boats beginning to maneuver away from their blockade positions. The appearance of a nuclear submarine in their midst had shifted the tactical balance completely, from controlling the situation to desperately seeking face-saving withdrawal. "Inform the Coup commander that NATO vessels will depart immediately with no punitive action, provided the harbor is cleared within 15 minutes. Maintain torpedo locks until all NATO vessels clear the channel." Admiral Benedetti's voice returned to the communication channel with a mixture of amazement and professional respect. "Captain Morgan, I'm watching Coup vessels withdraw from blockade positions. How did you achieve positioning without detection? The truth behind her success will shock you. Admiral, Arctic submarine navigation techniques adapted to warm water thermal layer exploitation. The Coup forces were prepared for surface engagement, not underwater infiltration. As the NATO vessels began their departure from Djibouti harbor, protected by the USS Leviathan's continued submarine presence, the tactical situation transformed completely. The Coup forces, faced with overwhelming underwater firepower they couldn't counter, abandoned their blockade strategy entirely. Within 2 hours, all 180 NATO personnel were safely evacuated aboard their vessels, escorted by the USS Leviathan until they reached international waters. The operation's success was total. No casualties, no escalation, no international incident that could destabilize the region. Captain, Commander Lawrence said as they cleared territorial waters. What you accomplished today will change how NATO approaches harbor blockade scenarios. David, what we accomplished today was proving that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one the enemy never sees until it's too late. But the final surprise was still waiting. Admiral Benedetti's final communication carried the weight of professional transformation. Captain Morgan, I owe you more than an apology. Your submarine tactics succeeded where surface engagement failed completely. NATO Command is recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross in offering you command of the new Mediterranean Submarine Operations Center as the USS Leviathan departed Djibouti waters with the NATO convoy safely under escort. Lex reflected on the mission that had challenged every assumption about submarine warfare in contested harbors and demonstrated that tactical innovation often came from applying proven techniques to unexpected scenarios. The Djibouti harbor operation became a landmark case study in naval tactics, proving that submarine capabilities could decisively influence surface engagements without firing a single shot, and that sometimes the most effective leadership came from those willing to think beyond conventional warfare limitations. And that's how Captain Alexandra Morgan revolutionized NATO harbor security operations forever.